I mean, we're all pretty dang special down here. On a personal note, I thought that we had busted up for good. I mean, it wasn't working for me. My friends didn't think so. I know yours didn't.
Okay, playtime's over. Let's toast this muffin.
Have you missed us?
What is happening, friends of CCP Podcasting Productions? Welcome back to Behind the Curtain. I'm your host, Chris Page. Usually my cohort and my counterpart, Mr. Brian Cady, would be in on the program, but, he's tied up with basketball until March, and, goddamn, we went long enough, and I figured we would get back into the swing of things. In order to do that, I needed to find me a counterpart, a co-host, someone to keep me in line and keep me in check. And there's only one of those on the face of the planet, and that is the one of my co-hosts of Ring Bell Radio. Also, some spot appearances on the WGWF podcast. He's John Cable. Brother, what is going on? And welcome to Behind the Curtain.
Well, I'm glad to be here. I don't think that I'm quite qualified for all of that responsibility, but I'll do my best.
Well, you can only work with what you got, right?
That is correct, sir.
Well, unlike previous programs, this is our real wrestling show. Brian and I were going to cover the AWA a while back, and we just never have gotten around to it. He's had other things going on. Obviously, he calls not professional basketball, sorry. He calls high school and college basketball. March Madness is right around the corner, so he's a little tied up. Today, though, we're going to dive into Jim Crockett Promotions, which obviously that's mid-Atlantic area. It's around starting back in like 1930s-ish. And we're going to go through some of the highs and lows all the way up to the sale to Turner in 88. So, John, I'm pleased to have you here to walk through this with me. And if you're ready to rock and roll, I say hoochie coo.
Well, I am pleased to be here for it. This is a really interesting time period in wrestling history. For real wrestling buffs that have really dove into, the pre-territories and the territory wars. This is kind of like before the NFL became the NFL. The big business hadn't come through yet. Vince McMahon hadn't swept the country yet. His dad was still, involved in the little territory bits that they were working on in their own space. There was a lot going on in the history of wrestling right here in this time period. And it was kind of the old Western days. We were just coming out of carnival days. We were getting real promotions to actually cover territories and go on circuits. Things were starting to become professional wrestling as we saw them move into the 80s. And that didn't get there without a lot of craziness going on in the 60s and 70s for sure.
Doing some research on this show, was not 100% sure when JCP started, and was shocked to find out that this promotion started back in 1935 by Jim Crockett Sr.
The wrestling promotion has its roots way, way back.
Back then, he was doing professional wrestling, concerts, some plays, some baseball, ice hockey. Like really and truly anything that you can promote. Jim Crockett Sr. was out on the grind, make it happen in the earlier years. Although, wrestling obviously, while it was a thing in the 30s, the 40s, the 50s, and 60s, it really took off in the late 70s and into the 80s, which we're going to get to shortly. But in order to get there, like, you really got to go through the earlier stuff because it's impressive in its own right. He had what JCP created: Championship Wrestling, All-Star Wrestling, East Coast Wrestling, Mid-Atlantic Championship Wrestling. I mean, the list goes on and on of programs that Jim Crockett Promotions was behind way back, in the 40s and into the early 50s. I think that shit is really interesting to know that before they sold, that their lineage did go back so long.
Well, and not only did it go back so long, but that was a different breed of wrestler that they were dealing with. The brand of wrestling that they were doing was nothing like we see today. Those dudes were legitimate, tough fucking dudes. Those guys were real fighters. And they would just go in and go ham and do it for the show and a few bits of dollars, man. There was nothing to it. And that's what they lived for.
It's like you remember the earlier days in wrestling, everything was 2 out of 3 falls.
Hmm.
So like pretty much every match was 30 minutes, 35 minutes. You had
I
some
mean, unless you were really fighting somebody that knew what they were doing.
Oh, for sure. I just think that to know that the history is that rich into the earlier stuff, it's kind of fun, kind of hard to believe. Uh, it wasn't until the 1952 that he joined the National Wrestling Alliance, and I think that's where a lot of our listeners are going to know JCP Promotions. Or Jim Crockett Promotions is going to be from their run with the NWA. But even then, I didn't know that they tied into the National Wrestling Alliance back in the 50s.
Yeah, way before a lot of people give them credit for it. And that early tie-in is what, it's real funny when they aligned with the NWA, right? The power structure was not centered around the Crockett family. Like it just wasn't. There were a lot of other people involved at that upper end. And when the Crockett's joined in, after the time that they spent with NWA, the family became very ingrained in what was happening with all of NWA. And they kind of became this pillar of what was happening. And it was interesting to see as the promotion NWA and all of the companies that worked under them kind of move forward into the modern era of wrestling, how much the influence of the Crockett family had over what happened in the territory. It was just really interesting to see how that all played out.
No doubt. I'm not very familiar with the old school NWA from the 50s. I'm not even going to pretend like I know. Um, I know that for starters, when he joined the National Wrestling Alliance in '52, I mean he was a focal point up until his death in 1973. Um, and even then, like there was speculation, like what's going to happen to the promotion, et cetera, et cetera. And that's where we get Jim Crockett Jr. This one of the eldest son. Um, kind of took over as chief executive, and this is kind of where things really start to trend upwards, is into the 70s and into the obviously into the 80s to what we refer to as the golden age of professional wrestling. Um, I wasn't alive back then. I didn't grace our green earth until '82. So I know that based on what history or reading up I've been able to do, it's I don't know. It's interesting to see. And George Scott, like there's a name that in later years obviously had ties to the WWE and Vince McMahon. Back in I think 92, 93, 94, 95 ish. I think that's when he was up there. Is back, coming in with Crockett Jr. as his booker. So it's almost like he came in and, John, you and I both know, being in the industry, like if somebody in the in the indies, if somebody fucking comes in and takes the book, then you don't know what's going to happen. And this is, Scott was a former professional wrestler as well, and tag team wrestler with Sandy Scott, and singles wrestler. So they came in '73 and really started to try and make some changes into what would come into like the golden age. I feel.
I think this is the point in the history of wrestling where it moves more from what MMA is now into what wrestling is. They realized that they couldn't just destroy each other in a ring every day and continue to tell a story about it and get the fans involved. And I think this is where showmanship and the show business aspect really started to play into it. And when they picked up the book and his son took over the NWA chair spot, this is when it started to become a production instead of a fight show. and they wanted to move it into what we've got as the modern era. And I think the foundations that they built were really designed around what Vince was doing and what the industry was doing around the time. When Vince moved to sweep the country with the WWF, there was only, reciprocate and build a better product so that you can hold a foothold or die for them. And they really had to come up with something that was going to promote their product to stand next to what the WWF was building. And I think this is where the modern era of wrestling comes from, is the need to compete with other companies and be on more TV screens or more radio stations or more advertising spots, whatever it was they were trying to get more ratings. And that was where the WWF NWA war kind of happened.
Excuse me. Um, in those earlier days, like one thing Jim Crockett Jr. did, we started eliminating a lot of programs early on. Um, Obviously, not necessarily financially, on a financial standpoint, but there's no need to tape, 4 shows a week, and I feel like back then, to put yourself in that perspective back then, it's a cost cutting measure, obviously, but it's a smart move to make. Take it down to 1 or 2 tapings every couple weeks. Mid Atlantic Championship Wrestling was born in what, 78, I believe. From there, it's when it really, really starts taking off, because that's where we get the introduction of Bob Caudle. I don't want to like act like everything that transpired in this, the earlier 70s wasn't a big deal up until 78, because it was. Obviously, it all led to where we're going, and groundwork had to be done. A lot of odds and ends were having to take place. When we start getting Mid-Atlantic in 78, and you got Bob Caudle, who, would go on to be, Hall of Fame announcer. And to think that this guy was a local weatherman.
I mean, he's got the voice for it. So, at the time that was really all that mattered. It wasn't like they were looking for the perfect look for television. They were still in the mindset of like, yeah, TV's a thing, it exists, there are TV shows and we're moving towards the TV, but a lot of early television was dictated by what worked on radio. So that was the mindset they were going into with the early television era of wrestling. Is what worked before was commentary, and you needed the right voices. And I mean, he had a head on his shoulders and knew about the business. He knew what was up.
I mean, between he and Gordon Soley, I think they're two of my favorite old school announcers of all time. I think if I had a Mount Rushmore of announcers, both would be on there, as would Bobby Heenan, and I would be torn between Jesse Ventura or Gorilla Monsoon.
Oh, if Monsoon's not on, it's not a Mount Rushmore.
Um,
I mean, Jesse's great and all, but I mean, come on.
well, I mean, I get it. That's why you're here, man. You got to keep me honest.
That's
Uh,
Jesse's great and all, but Gorilla Monsoon, dude, it's not called the gorilla position for nothing.
that's a good goddamn point. Um, they break some stuff down. They end up shooting what was I lost my spot. Mid Atlantic Championship Wrestling.
Yeah.
It led to several other commentators were in the mix, but before they finally land on David Crockett, who would end up being what I would consider the voice of Crockett Promotions. When I was a kid, growing up watching wrestling, and I grew up in the South, so obviously I was really big into the NWA stuff, because it was syndicated everywhere where I lived at. So I grew up on David Crockett for a good chunk of my childhood. He and Tony Schiavone ended up being the team that I would always like to sit back and listen to. They really start cranking up. I mean, we're going to backtrack and go back to 75. They did do Worldwide Wrestling. The host of the show was Ed Copperl, is what I'm seeing here. The announcers were Les Thatcher, George, and Sandy Scott. Um, they they did a lot of for that time frame. They did a lot of interesting little TV to try and pull an audience. And they did the short-lived, the best of the NWA. It probably syndicated show for the most part. But 78's where the blasting cap, I think, for what would probably set the tone for the next 12 years as far as NWA and WCW really started was right here, like into the 70s, into the 80s. You start getting Ric Flair, you start getting the Andersons, Barry Windham, Arn Anderson. Ole was already there, where he was part of the Minnesota Wrecking Crew. But you get so many pieces of talent, and this is where I'm going to get excited about the show. Don't get me wrong, I like doing the history, but I like reliving, from my childhood, what I can remember as the NWA and what I would see on Saturday nights with my dad and my aunt and my fucking grandma. I had at one point, excuse me, I had a 93-year-old grandmother or great grandmother. Back when I was a kid, I had to have been 7 or 8 years old, maybe younger than that, because my parents were still married. And I have this memory of her because it was around Christmas time. My dad was sitting in his chair. I was on this big ass fucking pillow in the floor. We're watching Saturday night, WCW Saturday night. Sting is on the Saturday. It may not have been called WCW Saturday Night at that point, but it was a Saturday show.
No, Worldwide was in the morning.
It very well could have been in the morning, or I don't remember. But
if it was Saturday morning, it was Worldwide, because that had the blonde guy, the bleach blonde dude with the dark beard. The Freebird.
Michael P.S. Hayes.
Yeah, Michael P.S. Hayes and Tony Schiavone did Worldwide on Saturday mornings.
Well, I don't remember which program it was. All I remember is Sting was on, and I had this. My great grandmother was 90 in her 90s, and she's screaming for Sting at the top of her lungs. Like, she's so bought into what, and it was a jobber match. At this point, looking back on it, Sting was giving the guy some heat. And my great grandmother went ballistic. That's the kind of stuff that I can remember growing up as a child watching.
To this day, if my mom ever runs into Ric Flair, she's gonna slap the taste out of his mouth.
I've met Flair several times. He's a fucking sweetheart.
Yeah, but my mom doesn't care. She, like you said, she was bought in, dude. Like, my mom hates Ric Flair. Hates him.
There's a lot. Obviously, where to even start? I mean, you can start with Harley Race and Ric Flair. Back in the earlier days of JCP, as far as
just if you look at the cadre of who's who in the Rogues Gallery of Ric Flair's best matches, like, you could just start anywhere in there, and then take any one of those men and go do the same thing for them, and you're on the same track. Like, the history of wrestling starts there, and the reason that it became successful is because these guys understood what the business was they were doing and just wanted to wrestle good. They wanted to showcase great talent. They were some of the best on the planet, and they're what designed the business. Show me what wrestling would have been without the territory wars and the men like the Four Horsemen and Sting and the group that came into early WCW and the NWA programs and the early WWF shows and the product with Harley Race and DiBiase and the Grahams and the Funks and the Nortons. You show me those old school guys and what came out of the talent that they brought into the business, and how could wrestling become anything other than what it is?
You make a good point. Sorry, I was rolling a skeeter. Yes, getting my joint ready. My bad. I can't remember which pay-per-view came first. I want to say it was Great American Bash. Was one of the first pay-per-views that
It was
JCP
real
did.
early.
When you think back at Crockett Promotions, what's your earliest memory?
So I did not have early memories. Again, I was not around when that was necessarily a thing. And early on in my childhood, where a lot of people were getting into wrestling, I was not allowed to watch wrestling at my grandma's house. She did not appreciate the violence of the show, and I only got to watch it in the summers when I went to my mom's. So I didn't get into any of the older stuff until I was in my teens, and then when I got into college and then became a wrestler is when I really started diving into the old stuff. But when I first dove into the history of what wrestling was about, I think my first bit, because it was what interested me, I've always been a WCW fan. So the first real thing that I would say I was introduced to, that was even remotely close to the Crockett Productions, was mid '80s WCW. Was the first thing that I saw, and it was Steamboat and Ric Flair match on a WCW Monday night, whatever the show was back then.
Hmm. I remember. I'm gonna answer the question because even though I was literally like maybe 2 years old, one of the first things that when I think NWA, and the first rivalries I think of isn't a Flair rivalry. I think about Roddy Piper and Greg Valentine. The dog collar match that they had. It was back in Starrcade '83. Um, it's the same. It was the same card that Rick beat Harley for the world title. Um,
That was good. That whole show was good.
oh, no doubt.
Like that whole show. You want to see classic? Look that whole show up.
Mhm. I think about that because, well, I know that there's a lot of dog collar matches that have happened before that and after that. Um, I don't know what it is about it that hooks me, but it still does to this day. I can go back and watch that match and not uh, bat an eyelash because it hooks me back
Yeah, you
in.
can't
Just
blink.
yeah, they just ripped into each other and tore the house down. Another thing that I think about when I think about Crockett is tag team wrestling. Um, I think about the Midnights. I think about the Minnesota Wrecking Crew. Uh, Ole and Gene and Ole and Arn in the earlier days before the Horsemen came about. There's so many talented tag teams that toured the circuits, the Freebirds, the Rock and Roll Express, um, the the what was it, the Bodacious Dudes or Bodacious Boys, or it was John
Something
Laurinaitis and
like
Shane
that. Yeah.
Douglas. that's
Yeah.
that's my jokey joke of the show. That or the
Well, it
Ding
just
Dongs.
if you think about it though, you know, in the earlier days before even Crockett Promotions, tag team wrestling was a major factor in wrestling in general. It isn't really until recently, in my opinion, that tag team wrestling has really taken a dive. And I think it's mostly on the promoters now are not as interested in tag team wrestling as a whole because single competitors and the merch that they can produce are more important to their bottom lines and profit margins. The single push angles and the title holders and whatever have you, I think is more important to the promoter now because it isn't about the matches or the wrestling. It's about how much money they can, and which is a shame that we've lost that aspect of what we love about the industry, but it's where we're at. And without that compassion for the camaraderie of the teamwork and tag teams, wrestling as a whole, and you can watch it happen through history, takes this roller coaster ride of viewership and how big it is as a business. And I think the times when tag team wrestling is prevalent and front and center stage are always the best ages in wrestling. I don't know how you feel about that, but I know that the Crockett promotions and the territory wars largely were fueled on stable and tag team interactions.
Well, it's no secret. I mean, you and I are friends. It have been for decades, at least a decade. You know how I feel about tag team wrestling. I love tag team wrestling. I think that to me, when done right, when the right teams are in there, teams can steal the show any fucking day. Um, and you're absolutely correct. Back way back in the day, back in Crockett promotions, until when Crockett Jr. took over, a lot of their stuff was tag team wrestling in those earlier years, because it draws. People want to see, you know, would you rather see one person go at it, or would you rather see four people go at it?
Well, and I think it's the I think it's the camaraderie of the teams themselves and the the addition of another person involvement that makes the fans become more involved and more energized by the group.
And the quality of the overall match. I mean, when you're looking at these earlier years, I mean, dude, like let's go back to Starcade '83. Your tag team championship match on that card was the Briscoe brothers versus Ricky Steamboat and Jay Youngblood.
Which is ridiculous, and that's a main event match anywhere today. Straight
Um,
up.
yeah, no doubt. 84, 80. So for context purposes, WrestleMania 1's not until 85. So they're doing Starcade, 2 years, 3 years before the first WrestleMania.
Which may not have been as big of a show, but it was a super show for them, and it was absolutely a pay-per-view caliber show.
Yeah, no doubt. Uh,
But they had to do stuff like that because they knew that WWF was building that kind of a platform for a network of places to do shows like that all the time.
yeah, I think, excuse me, I think by now Vince has already started to, Senior or Junior has already started to maybe buy up some of the talent, or is getting ready to go on that adventure to try and procure territories. Um, from Flair and Harley Race, you move into Flair and Dusty Rhodes, who they had a rivalry for years, with two back-to-back Starcade main events, if I'm not mistaken. Dusty is arguably one of the most charismatic individuals on the face of the planet when it comes to professional wrestling. There are few people who can touch the gift of gab from the American Dream, especially if he's fired up. When you think JCP, again, I think Piper. I go to Piper Valentine for my match, but obviously I think Ric Flair. I think Dusty Rhodes right there. Like within the first couple of seconds, Dusty's got to be on that mark because he did so much for that territory. He was booking it for a good chunk of time in the mid to late '80s, and competing and fucking making shit happen.
Hell, in the 2000s, he got me into wrestling. So him and Tommy Dreamer had a match here in town at the Morocco Shrine Auditorium at the card that I went to for ECW. And that night, I got a flyer from my trainers on my car window from the parking lot and had decided to go do this thing.
I got to see um, Dusty this was in Birmingham. It was at Boutwell. It wasn't pay per view. It was an indie, but they got Dusty and Raven in a singles match, which was just wild and insane. I think that. What do you think about his rivalry with Flair? Where are
I
you
think it
at with
was
it?
I think it was great, actually. I know there's a lot of controversy about why it happened or, what people thought about how it played out, but realistically, it was one of the early like modern era face versus heel angles that really played out on the big run. You know what I mean? So it was like the prototype of what would later become the Hogan Andre the Giant kind of feud. We hadn't seen, granted, there were always feuds. There was always the face heel thing. There were always the fan favorites and the ones they booed. Like, that's not new to this scenario. It's not like they revolutionized wrestling by doing a face heel angle. But in this one, they played it long ways. Like they ran with it for a long time and they designed it for a TV run. And that hadn't it was new for them to still to be doing, script work for long angle form television stuff. And this was one of the early ones that really hit and landed. And I think it designed both characters. While Flair had already had a history by then and was already a very large name and was working on his own legacy, I think this was one of the early paving stones that set him up to go into what would be his legacy later.
Well, the one thing about Flair and Dusty, and while it did run a hot minute, you had the incarnation of the Four Horsemen that came along during this time with Ole and Arn and Flair and Tully Blanchard. And while Flair and Dusty is going on in the forefront, right behind them's Tully and Magnum TA, which I think probably still, and call me a mark, their I Quit cage match in Greensboro was fucking ridiculous. As far as like storytelling and getting it to that boiling point, and Magnum finally got the win. He beat Tully for the belt. I think it was for the TV title. It's maybe the U.S. Championship. I don't remember.
Yeah, I think it was the U.S. belt.
U.S. belt. Finally gets the belt on Magnum, and it's the stepping stone for Magnum to eventually get to Flair, and Magnum's accident takes place, and what could have been with that particular individual, because he was, you go back and watch some of that old stuff, and you see him come out, Magnum, the ladies go fucking ballistic, and for the life of me, I don't understand why.
It's the same reason that even when Elvis got fat, they still went ham. You know what I mean? They're bigger than life. Think about it, in that particular time frame, that early to mid 80s, those guys were living like rock stars. Like absolute fucking Chad rock stars.
You had also, you had the Midnights and the Rock and Roll doing some stuff.
Again, tag team craziness leading the storylines
The
of the entire
Fantastics as
industry.
well. I mean, at one point, JCP had the World Tag Team Division and the United States Tag Team Division. I think that was in
Easy.
that time frame.
Yeah.
Before '88. There was you put Arn and Ole against anybody. The Legion.
And the
It's
match would come out
insane to
great.
me when we as I think about some of the names on this roster that came the Legion of Doom. It's nuts to see how this did not succeed. While at this point Vince has got the cartoon characters. Hulk Hogan must pose, and he's doing his thing, and he's making a lot of money, talent wise and ring work wise. Uh, I will
See,
always
and
say,
I've
go ahead.
always had the opinion about this too, where WCW was where wrestling fans went, and WWF was where television fans went. If you were a viewer, you fell into one of the two camps. You might like the characters in WWF, but the work was always for me in the WCW. It just was.
No, I like that perspective. Uh, excuse me.
But the difference was that Vince knew how to market way better than Turner did.
What could have been?
I mean, if Turner had had a better marketing department and had Vince's money and reach, I mean, who knows what would happen?
Well, when you have Vince McMahon go to, satellite providers at that point in time, or pay-per-view providers, and you want to carry WrestleMania, and you're not going to carry that. That says a lot, actually, about where things could have been, right?
If you look at it too, and especially in the late '80s, early '90s, the network wars were really hot, and that was a time when like people that ran networks had a lot of power in the entertainment industry. And Vince could just walk in somebody's office and throw down with anybody, anywhere, for any network, anytime he wanted to. And it was the Attitude Era that really nailed that for him. Like, if it weren't for the Attitude Era, I don't think Vince would have been able to strong arm networks like he would have in the end of the WCW time. I don't think he would have had that kind of swag if he hadn't had if he hadn't have had the Attitude Era be as successful as it was, and if wrestling wasn't at the peak that it was during the Attitude Era, I don't think he would have had the power to push network companies the way he did,
He had the stroke.
for sure.
Um,
And that started all the way back in the beginning, and you can see that from the response that that Crockett Promotions really made the push to become a TV product,
mhm.
because they saw the writing on the wall if they didn't.
Yeah, for sure. I can see that now. Like, I can see that perspective now, looking back on it. Like, yeah, they were starting to slowly pivot throughout the run. Uh, there was a lot of historic matches, a lot of great programs. One of the downfalls, what I feel, is probably the single biggest mistake that Crockett Promotions made was when they bought out Bill Watts in 1987. They bought the promotion. Bill Watts was running the UWF, I believe. Of course, he had Jim Ross there. He had Sting. He had Dr. Death, Steve Williams. He had a lot of talent in his own right. And what was the worst possible thing that they could have done? They didn't do anything with the promotion that they bought. They ran this one little super cards, what they called it, and then pretty much never touched it again. It lost so much money. And then literally that's right before Turner's set to take over. I think that was the beginning of the end, and that's why Crockett had to end up selling out to Turner in '88.
Well, it was between the cost of promotion and Vince McMahon really ramping up. Granted, he had just spent the $1 million to get his TV slot, and he was already doing Starcade, but WrestleMania became a thing, and production costs for TV became exorbitant, especially trying to compete with Vince in WWF.
It's all kind of the roller coaster ride, right? Like, they are early to mid '80s. I think that they're right there. They're right there with WWF. They're on par with Vince. They may not be getting big venues and big arenas, but they're selling out what they've got, and they do get those big cards that are in stadium events, etc. They do have those. I wonder what if. What if he wouldn't have purchased Bill Watts' territory? And what if he didn't have to facilitate the sale? What could have happened? It's all woulda, coulda, shoulda at this point. But the one thing that will always be cemented with Jim Crockett Promotions is the quality of wrestling. In the heyday, wrestling was what was on the marquee, and that is what they delivered. Um, you and I know there were so many acts that we didn't get to talk about and get to touch on. I mean, the Doom, for example, and the Road Warriors, they had a pretty good little thing going. The Freebirds, any kind of run that they had, um, it's just incredible. The list of talent, that was there. Barry Windham, Lex Luger. Luger may not have been the best worker, but he sold tickets. That's the name of the game, is to sell tickets. They had some of the best workers in the entire industry at one time, at any given time, especially 83, 84, 85, 86. 86 was arguably the best year in Crockett's history, but man, what could have fucking been?
Well, I mean, to really think about it, you're looking at a group of talent who by then has either been doing it for a couple of decades or was probably and most likely a second gen wrestler, right? They were in an industry that had been going on for several decades and had grown with the technology of the time and had been pushing into a new space in their industry. They had a lot of young guys that had a lot of talent and a lot of drive to become the superstars and live the rock star life that they were getting to see for the first time. And that ride for them was insane. Not to mention, they happened to be in the right place at the right time when network television was becoming a thing in everyday life, and people were tuning into the TV in greater and greater numbers every day. So it was just, it was a it was a maelstrom of exactly the right ingredients to make the industry explode when it did. And between Crockett and McMahon, they really had an innovative mindset to go into the industry and make it become something that it had always dreamed of being, but didn't have the ability to do yet. Well, they figured out a way to give it the ability, and they explored it to their for their full potential.
No doubt about it, man. I don't know where else to go with this one, so we'll go ahead and get ready to tie a bow on it. Let me ask you, if you could cover a territory or want to talk about a territory, say next week, what territory would you talk about?
For me, I think one of my favorite territories has always been Smoky Mountain Wrestling.
That is what we're going to discuss next week. We're going to dive into Jim Cornette and Smoky Mountain Wrestling. John, appreciate you joining me. Feels good to
It's
get back.
been a pleasure.
It feels good to get back on the horse with this show and get it back out there. And we'll be back next week. Are you going to join me? I didn't even ask you. I just kind of told you.
I will voluntold myself. Sure, I'm here
All
next
right, man.
week.
Well, we appreciate it, guys. For John Cable, I'm Chris Page. Next week, we'll be discussing Smoky Mountain Wrestling. This is a CCP Podcasting Productions. We are one last thing to say.
Thank you for being a friend.